Welcome back, everyone. So continuing our discussion and understanding of services, we are going to design how these two authentication and newsfeed features can be built as their own service, using all of the things that we've learned so far about the different components in a system. So to begin with, I want to talk about the newsfeed. So when you think about a newsfeed, this is pretty much the main thing we've been exploring and using as the main example to learn about the components of our system design. So we know that entering into our newsfeed service, we receive requests from wherever, most likely from a browser or client, to get posts. So this comes into our system and it hits our load balancer first. Our load balancer will then communicate and split up this load of requests to numerous amounts of web servers. These web servers, of course, are horizontally scaled, which means there are multiple of them. These web servers then all interact with the database, and the database houses all of the appropriate data for the posts. Our web server also will interact with a caching service so that we can optimize and figure out which groups of posts can be cached and are either regionally split or group-wise split amongst multiple users so that we can improve the user experience of serving them cached data instead of, again, the extensive service of interacting with our database. Then we also make sure that our web servers communicate with the job queue, and the job queue fires off jobs to the job servers. And these servers will then finally interface with the data sources where we get the appropriate posts so that we make sure that our database is up to date. The job server will extract the appropriate posts and then store them in the database so that our web servers can make sure that they're always extracting the latest posts that it needs in order to best satisfy this newsfeed service. So this, in a nutshell, is pretty much what our newsfeed service is doing. That's a design using all the components that we've seen so far. Next, what we want to explore is we want to talk about the authentication service. So this authentication service, similarly, we're going to receive requests for logging in. And for now, let's just focus on a very basic login, that's email and password. It's going to come into our system, our authentication system, and it's going to interact with the load balancer. The load balancer is going to work with web servers, again, numerous web servers that run application logic or business logic that have to do with logging the user in with email and password. Now, in order for us to verify this, we need a database to keep track of all of our users and their appropriate emails and password. This is pretty much all we need. It's a very simple system for logging and authenticating users. Now, this right now is just one-factor authentication using just email and password. It's very rudimentary, and there's much more significantly complex versions of authentication that we can do or authorization, but we'll discuss those much later. For now, as far as our understanding of authentication goes, we all know email password login, so we're just going to keep it simple for this authentication service. So now that we have this combined with our newsfeed service, we can now think about how our overall system is comprised of these two services. And then, of course, our application system, meaning our overall system of this Facebook application that we're looking at, is pretty much containing these two individual services inside. Now, again, what we've done here is we have built two separate services that serve two separate features. This is where we can start to understand services a little better. A service is essentially, you can see it almost as a complete project. It's isolated in the sense that it focuses on one singular responsibility. When you think about the term microservice architecture, what you're doing is you're building your system as a composition of small services, and a service is a self-contained deliverable system. And the whole idea of that service is that it does one thing really well, or one domain. So authentication can be a domain. It specializes in figuring out users and what they have access to. So when you try to log in, well, you're always going to interact with the authentication service because that logging in feature is something that the authentication service specializes in. The newsfeed service doesn't need to do any of the heavy lifting when it comes to figuring out how to log in a user. Why would it need to govern that? The newsfeed service focuses purely on everything related to the newsfeed. But as we're going to see, maybe the newsfeed service benefits from some of the things that the authentication service can provide it. Where this lies is in the fact that when we think about our newsfeed, again, it's a personal feed, meaning that there are very specific posts to the user that we want to return. Now, how that works is going to be through a access token system, which we're going to walk through to understand how inside of our system, these two separate services interact with each other. So here in our application system, we're going to add in load balancer as the entry point, and we're also going to add web servers. So here, let's walk through the logic of what these two pieces do when actually interacting with the overall system. The web servers, of course, communicate with the two services, the authentication service and the newsfeed service. And when we look at how a browser client makes requests now with our overall application in a more realistic example, we'll see how this all works. So the browser client, when you land on Facebook for the first time, what you want to do is we always prompt them, can you log in first? Because everything begins only when you've logged in and we know who you are. So now the login request comes in through the load balancer, which gets sent to the web servers. At this point, the web server now has to decide, this is a login request. What am I going to do with this? Which service gets the login request? Obviously, the authentication service. Again, we've split up the responsibilities. The newsfeed service does not need to do anything with logins. So this login request gets sent to our authentication service, and then our authentication service will send back an access token. Now, this access token gets stored on the browser client. So what is an access token? Well, an access token is something that allows our system to know that the user is who they say they are. It's something unique generated by the authentication service, and the authentication service holds onto for a session of the user so that we know that this user is who they say they are without them having to constantly log in over and over again. And now when this browser client requests posts from our system, it gets an access token attached to it. This access token goes with the requests in order for us to verify that the user can get what it gets. So here, this then gets passed to the web servers again. The request comes through the load balancers. And now what happens when the web server receives, hey, I'm getting a request posts with the access token. What we're going to do is we're going to first have to verify that this access token is a valid access token. So the web server will send the access token to the authentication service. The authentication service will then verify whether or not this access token is valid. If it is, it sends it back. Sometimes this access token is modified with permissions in order for us to make sure that we know what permissions are allowed on this access token. The reason for this is so that we can verify in our other services what the user has access to. For example, with the user A, they shouldn't be able to access posts for user B, C, D, or E. The access token is what's going to dictate what this user has access to. The newsfeed should not have to entirely be responsible for that. Sometimes it is. Again, it's context-driven. We're just walking through an example here. Now that we have our up-to-date and verified access token on our requests, then finally our web server knows, okay, I'm going to pass this request into the newsfeed service. The newsfeed service then again sees that the access token is verified, so it now does what it needs to do, goes through its logic, and then extracts out the required posts that our browser asked for, and then sends that back. And our web server finally sends that through to the browser client, and now our browser can actually show the appropriate posts. And that is the new flow of how you break up all of this system that we've looked at into services. And the reason why we walk through this example is because this is a very common division of labor in a system design. Authentication service is almost always its own service. But hopefully now what we've looked at is how services operate. What is that abstraction of a service? Again, it's where you break up your features of your website, or you break up the different components, like large level, high level components in your system into more independent services. And a service, again, is a self-contained system that delivers a very specific functionality, and you do it in a way that other services or other systems can utilize it and communicate with it for that intended purpose. The easiest one to look at is a newsfeed service or an authentication service. Authentication as a service is a system that solely cares about authenticating the user and figuring out things related to the user. And now with the authentication service being good at its domain, other services and features can rely on it to help them be better at their function. As we saw with the newsfeed service, it can now rely on the authentication service to identify the user being who they say they are, but also it can determine through the authentication service the level of access to provide to this user when it comes to what posts to give back. And this style of microservice architecture is extremely common at scale, which is why it's such a key component of system design. By breaking up your system into smaller services, especially at scale, you can picture how a lot of these websites build very large, complex, robust features. By having this separation of responsibility into individual services, you're able to have teams hyper-focus on improving those individual domains as services. With this being such a crucial part of system design, throughout the rest of this course, we're going to hyper-focus a lot on breaking up features into services and thinking about services as a cornerstone of how to design our system. But for now, this I felt like was a great time to just get into our minds the idea of abstracting services. We've learned a lot about how these components build into systems, and services is kind of like a higher level abstraction from these smaller components that we've looked at so far. Again, these different services are often microsystems in themselves. Just as we saw, we designed 2 different services with the components that we've already worked with, and we fit them together into a larger system that we are very familiar with, even just as users. So now that we understand services at a high level, let's continue with the next topic in our system design. I'll see you in the next video.